How's everyone doing? Okay, glad to see you all here, and yeah, it's an honor to be here with you all. We did not expect this I'm with GSV. We did not expect this level of engagement and excitement, so just so thrilled. I'd love to start off by getting a sense of who's in this room. Who here, by a show of hands, is an entrepreneur? Awesome. Who here is works as a chief learning officer or learning talent leader? Awesome. Oh, hey, Brandon. Hey, Praveen. Hey. Who here works for a nonprofit? Awesome. Who here works for K-12? Wow. Okay. Higher ed? Wow. Okay. Terrific. So we got a nice range, and yeah, thrilled to see a room of such diverse perspectives. My name is Kevin Zhang. I am a principal at GSV Ventures, and at GSV, I focus on workforce learning and adult consumer learning. So this is a topic I'm extremely excited about. I'm a huge believer in as an area to really disrupt learning for the workforce. And hand-selected each person on this panel because they really represent the best of this theme and this topic. So we're really excited to dive in. Their bios are on the app and elsewhere, so we'll just dive right into it. Ken, I'd love to start with you. Ken's the CEO of a company called Tango. And Ken, before Tango, had a variety of experiences working at Uber, at Atomic, actually dropped out of HBS to do Tango. Clearly, there was a level of conviction you had in this theme of learning the flow of work. What gave you that conviction?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you can probably hear me anyway. I think it's this conviction around like how learning in the workplace is changing. So if we think back to like prehistoric era, you had to leave your computer to go through a training to take that knowledge and then hopefully apply it. And then we got a little bit better and we said, okay, actually let's make that like training modules that people will have to attend. Very similar to what I experienced in Deloitte when I started my career. And then it became, oh, let's do actually like bite-sized stuff. We'll call it micro-learning, right? And it'll be 10 minutes or 15 minutes and people can consume that as they please. But that still wasn't really delivering. And so, you know, for us, myself and my co-founders, Brian and Dan, we kind of said, how can we meet people when they need answers, as opposed to expecting them to seek out knowledge on their own, hopefully maybe find those answers, and then remember to like have those synapses firing in the moment where they needed to apply it. That felt really challenging. So when we started Tango, we said, how can we digitize shadowing, which is the most synchronous? I'm trying to complete a task. I have a process in front of me. I want to get it done. And that's really where learning in the flow of work came from.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd love to move the conversation to Christina. You're an executive at NovoEd, where learning flow of work is a newer focus of yours. And what NovoEd has done so well with your kind of core product being around cohort-based learning is delivering outcomes and great learning experiences, right? So how do you think about learning flow of work, which, if you think about a Grammarly as an example or Tango, it is lighter scale, right? So how do you think about that in terms of delivering outcomes and delivering massive kind of learning transformation?
Thank you, Kevin. Such a great question. Really honored to be here. Let me start with a really simple concept. Learning outcomes emerge from places of proof. So in that sense, learning in the flow of work is like the ultimate outcomes driver because it's all about that place of proof, that moment of performance, when you have to actually show what you know. If you think about it, what's going on there is enormously complex. In a matter of minutes sometimes, seconds even, you have to figure out what's being asked of you, diagnose the situation, read in between the lines, activate your working memory, do the thing which could require actual physical coordination. You have to get the results, get the feedback, reflect, metacognate. There's a lot that's going on there. It's enormously complex. But here's the thing. The human brain loves moving through those challenges. It's fun. It's satisfying even when it actually works. So in that sense, I think learning in the flow of work can be this amazing retention and satisfaction driver, can transform work into this constant state of focus and flow by isolating what the learner needs at any given moment and then gently serving that up, whether that's hard skills or soft skills or systems intelligence and ease with tools and software. But if you ask me, the isolating and the diagnosing, that's the hard part. That's the existential issue at the heart of learning learning in the flow. Because as far as work is concerned, you could fail for any reason. You could fail because you can't have the difficult conversation, because you're not tracking to the other person, because you're not self-aware, because you can't use the tool, because you can't interpret the data, because maybe you're just frustrated and you're psyching yourself out. So, but I think that even then, beyond mastery, performance, and productivity, there's a whole other arena of soft and meta outcomes which I think are equally as important. So in the range of technologies that I've covered, from adaptive learning to virtual reality to most recently social and collaborative cohort-based learning, I'm struck by the metacognitive and social emotional potential of learning in the flow. I mean, we're talking about things like reducing stress in the moment, fighting fight or flight in the moment, building confidence in the moment, lending peer support in the moment. I mean, all that you have at the end of the day is the moment. So I think that learning in the flow of work can be this amazing tool for increasing the intensity and the horsepower of the moment, and then the velocity of the entire firm. So when we're thinking about outcomes, I think we have to move beyond just the obvious hard outcomes, the mastery, performance, and productivity, to some of the softer outcomes, and actually creating a virtuous cycle between them, the hard and the soft, so that your performance is actually improving your mindset, and your mindset your performance, and they're constantly building off of each other.
Yeah, thank you. I love that. I want to turn over to Melanie after, because I think what I'm hearing so much about that is disrupting how we've done things today, right? Put it very simply, Melanie, I know you have a lot of views on this. How do we disrupt e-learning as we know it? How do we end traditional e-learning as we know it?
Hello? All right, this is on. I will try and bring as much energy. I admire that fierceness. So when I think of e-learning, I think of, or just learning in the workplace in general, I think of it more as an event or a destination, right? Like someone either goes somewhere to go learn something, or someone attends a live training of some kind. And most companies approach, onboarding, which is kind of your most obvious example of learning, in a very linear fashion. The challenge, though, is that when it comes to an employee joining a company and learning the multitude of systems and workflows that they need to learn, learning the multitude of competitors and industries, this amount of information that is increasing by the day that employees are expected to memorize and know, your traditional kind of course or destination or one-time training just doesn't adapt, because there is just so much change happening every single day. And that's where I think just-in-time learning, or learning in the flow of work, becomes really relevant, because it's all about how do we make sure that, to what Ken was mentioning, the right information meets the employee when and where they need it. Because you can have two employees join on the same day, right? Let's take two sellers, for example. But depending on whether they were competing against the same competitor or not, whether they are selling to the same industry or not, they're gonna have to have different knowledge at different points in time. And so I think that, learning in the flow of work really allows companies to personalize learning in a way that your traditional e-learning or courses or webinar trainings just doesn't. And I think that's really the biggest opportunity for companies, is to adapt their learning to be much more agile and adapted to today's pace of learning, right? Much more bite-sized, to your point, micro-learning, but adding this element of context, adding this element of time that traditionally just hasn't existed.
Brandon, it's a perfect segue to you. As a chief people officer at Zapier, you think a lot about that perspective of leading learning in your organization. Talk about a little bit of actually Zapier's, how you all approach managing learning within your organization, because I think it's really unique, and I think it'd be great for this audience to hear, and also how you think about automation as it pertains to learning in your organization.
Sure. I'll take that last one first, because it leads to the former. So how does automation show up especially in a company whose product is software workflow automation? The number one thing, Asan, I joined Zapier just about 2 years ago, so this is a big wake-up call for me too, is you just think about, by automating the tedium, right? It's not necessarily like the life-giving work. Christina, you talked about this, like the joy of getting the work done. Well, it has a lot to do with the work being done, and if you can automate the tedium away, or at least a meaningful portion of it, the stuff that's left is more of the stuff that people are uniquely capable of doing and doing well. And when I joined Zapier, I saw so many roles where the ratio of that like life-giving, more creative, like superhuman-centric work was a lot higher than I was expecting, in part because the team was working really hard to abstract or automate a lot of that tedium out of the way. And so what you're left with is the more complex work, where learning in the loop, where you're making all of these dozens and dozens of judgment calls when you're writing a memo or preparing a sales presentation or whatever the case may be, a lesson plan, right? How many things do we coach our teams on where the answer is, it depends? And then the interesting part is, well, what does it depend on, right? And so being able to be like in the moment, right, with folks, these modalities like coaching, like that's not new, right? Apprenticeships, those aren't new, right? But it's all about like being there with the person who's doing the work and trying to make those dozens of judgment calls around how do I do this piece or what does it depend on, right? Help me do the task, but also help me understand the what does it depend on so I can do it or apply that judgment better in the future. With automation and AI together, you have all of these opportunities to do that at a scale that surprises me, right, as the person who's actually accountable for that and seeing it every day.
Yeah, where does it surprise you? I'd love to hear what you've seen at Zapier.
Well, the other trend that's going on alongside these is no code, right? This isn't new, but if you combine like automation with no code, automation, no code, and AI, it starts to get really interesting. My own people team, we are not technical experts by any stretch of the imagination, has been able to use our existing product plus some of the ChatGPT and what have you that we all have access to now at very little cost to actually snap together like very purpose-built applications like dozens of different coaching bots to help folks understand like how should our core values apply in this situation, or how can I write a better performance goal on this task that my managers just asked me to do, or I'm having a performance issue with someone on my team, like help me think about it. And so even let's say like a HR business partner or an employee relations person on my team gets to spend less time doing the kind of tier 1 or even tier 2 type of questions with our folks, and they get to focus on like the truly complex stuff and also the capacity building for the actual managers themselves.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'd love to bring it back to Melanie. You all at Spec have been around for about 5 years. You've seen a few shifts now with, there was pre-COVID, COVID, now generative AI, has certainly changed things. In your view, how do you think AI will change how companies need to think about learning?
Heavy question. So the first thing I'd say is that I think AI, more than anything, is just going to accelerate the movement to learning in the flow of work, right? If we think about ChatGPT, it's essentially just this chatbot that's going to be available to employees almost instantly to answer any question. Now, in many ways, that's exciting, right? Because there's a lot of organizations that struggle to document things. There's a lot of organizations that struggle to create formal training, especially scaling technology companies that are moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. So it's great that now there's going to be this new alternative way of learning that's accessible to employees. The challenge there is moderation, right? Because ultimately, if companies don't figure out how to make sure that their own source of information is accurate, there's going to be this next really, really easy and accessible alternative that employees are going to start relying on as truth. And the reality is, I think that especially this next generation of employees that are going to be entering the workforce, they're used to accessing everything absolutely instantaneously, right? Like they grew up with smartphones, they grew up with Uber, Amazon, everything at one click of a button. And so they don't know what it's like to have to go to work and not know where to find an answer, not know how to find a process, and not know who to contact because they're used to having everything instantly. And so the challenge is that ChatGPT in some ways becomes very familiar to them, and that's exciting. On the other hand, that's a big risk, right? For anyone here in this room that works in financial services, insurance, real estate, where there's risk to consider, that's dangerous, right? Because now employees are going to have this super easy alternative that you don't necessarily have control over. And so in some ways, when I say it's going to accelerate things, now companies are going to have to figure out how do they govern, how do they moderate that? How do they make sure that they have just as easy as an alternative that has the answer that they want employees following from a process standpoint? I think that governance and content moderation is going to increase in importance significantly. I think that companies, it's interesting because in one way, I think AI will accelerate a lot of jobs. At the same time, I think when we all leave this conference after we've talked about AI for the next 3 days, when we go back to our own workplaces, we're going to realize, like, wait, that very basic process that we need documented, like our sales stages, we still don't have documented. Why? Because companies still haven't built a culture and a habit of documentation. And so I think AI can help there too, right? How do we make AI help generate content more efficiently? And so I think what's going to be interesting is if you kind of break out the cycle of learning or the loop of learning into the needs identification layer, right? How to identify what kind of information employees need to know or need to learn and when do they need to learn it. The actual content creation, like can we create this content in a much more efficient manner? The consumption layer, where and when does someone actually access that information? And then the engagement layer, right, which is like how can we get that feedback from employees in real time to understand whether that information is helpful to them or not. There's a lot of different applications of AI. But I think it'll start with the content generation. And then as companies start generating their own content, and as people start consuming more of it, there'll be that next kind of challenge around governance and moderation.
I'd love to hear Ken's thoughts on this too. I know it's quite relevant to you all.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about this validation piece, right? Because documentation, I think we've all been there. You act on a process that's out of date or stale, right? We've all done it. I've done it. We probably do it daily. So AI will help us, generate a lot of content, but how do you validate that process? And so, what Tango's focused on is how do we document the processes and tools within your company? Those processes and tools are changing all the time. That's what we felt at Uber too. We are constantly refining this playbook for how we launch markets, because it was like, oh, we learned something new about the business. It's changed. So validating that is about keeping that human in the loop to say, okay, here's what we've been able to create with AI. How do you help us understand what's relevant and what's still fresh? So we're building a lot of functionality to be able to do that, which is critical because with AI you can get yourself to a point, but that human brilliance then goes missing if you're not validating it.
I'd love to ask Christina this, but also anyone to the group. But human in the loop, is obviously a very important concept. Where do we think there needs to be human in the loop, and where do we think there doesn't need to be human in the loop? I'd love for you to start, and I'd love to get other views too.
Let's see. I think as an industry, we started off in this domain with this obsession with hard skills, so recommendation engines that optimize streams of micro content based on their engagement and their popularity, and incredible feats of engineering and infrastructure, which I think is all really wonderful and very impressive, but it's also kind of myopic and kind of misses the point, which is how skills actually show up in the real world, which is messy and intertwined and bundled and often with this higher order human component. And so I think that it's really, really interesting that honoring the true complexity of life and work has been actually reserved for formal education for the most elite members of our society. So think about the case study, holistic scenario-based approach that's often taught in these MBA programs. But I think that's changing. I think that, we'll take something large and abstract like inclusive leadership, for example. No longer do you have to wait for some sort of high potential program that you're tracked into or an elite MBA program where you can sit around and talk about case studies together. Right in the flow of work, you can actually practice a difficult conversation using a mobile device in your pocket and then get feedback immediately from your peers. You can crowdsource ideas. You can review a gallery of submissions and see how other people handled a similar challenge. And so I think, but I think for these snippets of learning to pay off and really manifest, I think they still have to be attached to something broader. They have to be contextualized, I think, ideally by a long-form, cohort-based, group-based learning program that brings all this practice, application, feedback, and expertise together in a cohesive way. And I think that's how you get the deep capabilities like leadership, innovation, and salesmanship that you usually have to go to school for, by balancing the structure and spontaneity, by bringing hands-on immersive experience into contact with the context, nuance, and empathy that comes from learning long form in groups. So I think that's the future of these sorts of higher ordered bundled skill sets. Just-in-time learning meets just-in-case learning mediated by cohorts.
Wow. Brandon, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Human in the loop, where do you think that's going to be most important? Where do you think we can take it out? I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, the pattern that we're finding most powerful in our work right now starts with the human, right? So it's because we have to, knowing what are you trying to achieve, right? What is the outcome? We haven't found anyone yet, a chatbot or whatever the case may be that can answer that for us, at least not by itself, right? So we still have to have a point of view on strategy and prioritization and how are we going to know progress or a win when we see it. So that's the starting point. From there, we've been using generative AI to help us get started. So a very small example would be my team set out to write a like meeting recording policy because we didn't have one, right? And increasingly actually using some of these technologies, like it's actually really helpful. In fact, our recruiting team is using something like that now where with the consent of all the people we interview, we record those meetings and it crunches all this really useful coaching information that the recruiter and their manager can use to help them level up over time. So really good example there, but we need a policy for that. So into ChatGPT goes the request, like, hey, we're just trying to write this policy. Can you give us a first cut? Gives us a first cut. Then we hear from the general counsel and say, hey, did you consider this particular aspect about how long we're going to hold on to the recordings? Hey, can you write up like what's common here? We still, again, have to have a point of view. At the end of the day, if the policy has holes in it or if it's not accounting for something that matters for the team, my team is accountable, right? I can't point at the generative AI tool we used and hold it accountable. We are still accountable. Humans are still accountable at the end of the day. And so the polishing step, right? It's giving us a massive head start. That's really useful, right? But we still have to polish it. And then, Ken, to the point you were making earlier, if next week we wanted to create a coaching bot around that policy, so folks who have like edge questions around it wanted to get just like an initial read on how should I think about it using the policy, now we have the reference documentation to feed into that for the coaching bot.
What, with all this innovation happening, I'd love to hear Ken and Melanie's perspective on what scares you the most as two founders right now. Going off what Brandon said.
Related to AI, right?
Yeah, exactly. Either is fine, anything, But what's scaring you the most right now? I mean, as talking about accountability for the human, I mean, founders are not going to be, that's human in the loop. That's they're not being replaced. That's a pretty judgment-oriented job. What's scaring you guys right now?
I mean, I think about it as, what's scaring our customers, right? So we have this viewpoint that the processes that you use to run your company is your IP, right? That's what made Uber uniquely successful. That's what makes a lot of companies uniquely successful. And so when it comes to AI and how we're building that functionality, we have to think long and hard about how much are we leveraging at the global level? Oh, you use HubSpot a bunch, so does this company. Let's define some of those processes across companies. Or does that stay at the local level where it is so nuanced and the instances are so personalized and it's unique to your business that the use of AI and the application of it lives there. So I think that's something that we're wrestling with. And maybe there's a threshold in between where we can say, okay, we have some understanding of, I'll say HubSpot again, because we had 20,000 workflows created on HubSpot last year. We have some understanding of that we can leverage across our customers, but at what point does it become IP for those customers? We don't want to be making recommendations that reveal the secret sauce.
How about you, Melanie?
I'll answer from two different angles. So from a kind of future of our product, right? So we overlay inside of any application that your employees are working in to surface the information they need to know in that moment, whether that's learning the tool or the process or the information they need to know to do their jobs. From kind of a threat to our existence as a company, I think about, in 10 years, what will the UI that an individual works from look like, right? Will it just be a chat interface that is so deeply integrated with all these plugins into all your different technologies that, all this time that we've invested into perfecting this overlay wherever the employee is working kind of becomes obsolete. So I think that's an interesting thing for us to think about. And if so, how do we think about integrating in other ways? And again, we're talking about a minute number of companies that would actually be there. There's a whole global set of companies that will be far behind. From company building, I just think about kind of the future of people, like really getting clear on like how will we develop skills like critical thinking? Because when I look at our biggest challenges as an organization, it kind of comes down to like where was the common sense in this situation? And I see this in some cases work ethic. I see a big difference between generations of employees that we have and the work ethic, and how do we get them to really understand that like there's a certain sense of fulfillment that comes from like putting in the work, putting the hours, seeing that result come and being like, yes. And that creates, in some ways, your drive, or at least I think so. So I think about, with AI automating, to your point, a lot of the mundane, how do we make sure that we are still creating training programs and really focusing on our managers to help develop critical thinking, to help develop the kinds of common sense. Because at the end of the day, like, I still believe it's true, people buy from people, right? Like, you can go to any company's website and do an endless amount of research and be pretty much 90% confident with which choice of software you're gonna do based on the feature differences, right? But at the end of the day, like, your choice often comes down to the company that you enjoy partnering with most, who impresses you the most in the sales process, who seems like they're really gonna have your back if something goes wrong. And so how do we continue to develop and instill those skills in our DNA as a company in a world where it might be easier to be efficient than it is to be effective? And how do we really instill that, nuance? So,
Brandon, I'd love to dig into something that happened at Zapier a few months ago. You all, with all the craziness in the tech world, and of course you guys, it's ironic because you guys are an automation company. You all didn't lay off people. You all retooled people, and that was quite unprecedented. And that could be something that we think of a lot more as jobs get changed quickly. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that for this audience. How did you all think about that whole process, managing it internally?
I mean, so I'll say a couple of caveats. So Zapier, the thing that's worth noting is that there are a lot of companies that had their backs against a wall and still do, over these last 9 months or so, and not every company is in a position from a pure paying the bills perspective to do what Zapier did. But there are some that do, and we're not alone in what Kevin's describing, where our rate of hiring was slowing down. We were, trying to play it conservative until we could understand, which way was up. And as a result, our hiring team, which we had built up over a number of years, full of really skilled folks, didn't have as much work to do as they were used to. And we made a decision, like a CEO, CPO, and CFO decision, like locked arms together, that we were going to repurpose that talent for as long as that surplus capacity was temporary in our eyes. Permanent or semi-permanent, like can't see when hiring is going to pick up again. That's a totally different ballgame from our perspective. But certainly at that time, we thought it was going to be temporary. We knew we had really talented folks. And it's so interesting. Did we have like a perfect software, like skills matching algorithm to perfectly place folks automatically? We absolutely did not. We did it almost entirely manually, but the population size was reasonable. It was 12 to 15 folks. And we wanted to try it. And that's maybe one of the takeaways here is that, with automation and AI, it's like easy to go like straight to scale. But when we're doing something new, it can be really important to start small and actually start inefficient, right? Once you know the outcome that you're trying to produce or that the method that you're trying to use to get there actually works, like then the scale starts to get really interesting. But interestingly, even at Zapier, which is an automation company, we have a value called build the robot. And one of the caveats in the build the robot value is like start inefficient, right? Do it manually, hack at it until you've got it, and then automate your way through to scale. And so with this particular program, which we call our Sammut program, we were able to rotate recruiters and sourcers across the business into other high-need areas. And just like any other talent or talent management program, like we do surveys around it and measure the impact, and we're learning a lot too. And not all of it was perfect, but we were able to show the company that that's our instinct. And it's really incredible to hear folks far beyond, the recruiting or HR area, what that's meant to them to see us try. And sometimes stumble, and sometimes fail, but that's what we are trying to be about.
Did you want to add something? No.
Oh, I was going to say, follow up on something that Melanie said. I think one of the great dangers of AI is that we start to use it as a sort of crutch and encourages mental laziness. I think at the end of the day, we still have to embrace cognitive exertion. I think the struggle is part of the point. And I think we have to remember that if neurons are firing in the brain, we're winning to some extent. I mean, you want to be problem solving, you want to be tinkering, you want to be experimenting. So I think we should recognize the limitations of AI and kind of celebrate it, because it's still up to us and under our control at the end of the day. And I think the goal of all learning should be to convert a push dynamic into a pull dynamic, because there really is only pull at the end of the day. So I think by making problem solving more fun and more satisfying, I think that AI-powered learning in the flow can actually encourage curiosity and experimentation and bring that out again. And I think that's how we as employers can have it both ways. You know, the creativity, the agility, the experimentation, and then also the consistency and the predictability that we want at the same time.
Go ahead, Ken.
I think that's all well and good, but sometimes you just want to get shit done, too. Like, I mean, the struggle is great, and getting through that and learning and building repetition is great, but like what we've focused on is you just want, like, a lot of times you want to get shit done, and sometimes it's undifferentiated stuff. Like 97% of it can be undifferentiated steps that you just know how to do. How do we get to those moments that Brandon was talking about where there is judgment to be made? I think that's an important point when we think about how learning is changing too. Like people spend, it's a McKinsey study, people spend 20% of their week searching for the right information. And sometimes the struggle is valuable, but sometimes it's just really annoying and you just want to get something done. So that's the caveat that I'd add to that, Christina. But you know, I agree that there's a good virtue in going through the struggle.
I want to build off both of your points here. When you think about the world of learning and the challenges we're trying to attack here at GSV and beyond, there's some really big challenges around skills, around people being vastly underemployed or unemployed. How much of these big problems, let's just start with the capability kind of crisis that we have, do you think can be solved with your technologies around learning the flow of work? Or do we think it's just really a small piece, a very important piece? I mean, it works and it's making money and it's crazy effective, but how big can this get in terms of the problems we can solve? Go ahead.
I can start.
Yeah.
We very much focus on like internal processes, systems training, and like sales enablement. So it's kind of a limited scope. We don't do as much of the soft skills training. That said, like I think there are some interesting challenges that we solve. Like for example, we've hired a number of individuals to our BDR team, which is business development representatives. It's kind of like the first entry level of sales for those of you that aren't familiar. And like some of them are like individuals that have had like 13-year careers as restaurant managers that are able to enter. And they're able to enter because like everything they need to know, to your point, like all that kind of like basic stuff, like where do I click, where do I go, when do I submit a quote, like all that basic knowledge is at their disposal. And so their managers are able to really just focus on like, hey, here's what it looks like to actually engage in a sales conversation with someone, and here are the soft skills that you need to know, and like really coach on that, knowing that, you know, whether it's 97% or in our case maybe, you know, 70, 80% of that is just already served up to them when they need it. And so they can do that on their own. And so I think of that inspires me. Like outside of our own company, we've heard of it anecdotally from a number of customers across financial services, airline industries, and others, where if we can figure out like how do we make it so easy for anyone to join a company, regardless of background, skill set, et cetera, for some of these entry-level jobs that are relatively easy, where their biggest block is technology acumen. I think that's a big kind of challenge that we can help remove, and that also can potentially open up to a more diverse workforce. I also think, one last piece, and then I'll pass it over. I also think that when we think about like remote workforces, being a female founder, I care a lot about the topic of how do we get more women in the workforce. And a lot of women, I think, you know, COVID and the shift to remote open up the doors for a lot of working women, right, to be able to continue their careers in a more flexible environment. And I think learning in the flow of work, just-in-time learning, instant access to knowledge and information enables that, right? Enables the ability for someone to be successful on their own time with the confidence they need to be able to do their jobs in a digital-first environment. And so I think that those are two interesting challenges that it can help solve.
I think Melanie said it best, didn't she? I would just say +1 to that. Yes, I agree. I completely agree. This is like, it'd be like a beautiful irony if some of these like super disruptive, scary, like very discomforting like tech trends like AI can actually help us like be more human. Like let's make bigger bets on each other, right? But not in a like irrational way, right? Like you spoke to it, right? Like in a very tangible way, right? Like I just think about like the bets that we could make on folks switching into completely different careers, entry level and beyond, right? Folks well into their careers, being able to path into a totally different, they bring over core skills, but an entirely new subject matter area. And the other thing I just loved about what you said, Melanie, is just the diversity and inclusion component of this. Like you think about all the ways you can immediately like switch modalities, switch languages, switch like, and even just the availability of like when the coaching, right, or that learning in the moment, learning in the flow of work is actually available. Like there are some really uncomfortable things about what we're talking about, but there are some massively hopeful things too.
I think that AI and generative AI actually really raises the criticality of higher order human skills. And so I think that organizations of the future will be distinguished by their ability to rapidly sense make in this VUCA world, this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, and then to rapidly crystallize not just knowledge, but mindsets, behaviors, systems, whole processes, and then rapidly transmit them from cohort to cohort. So I think I'm really fascinated by this concept of corporate memory. And this is where learning in the flow of work meets creator economy, because I think what we can do is, if we're creating all this content as a byproduct of work, like PowerPoints and videos and just documents, we can use AI and platforms to capture this content and create corporate memory and then pass that on to other cohorts of learners. And I think that ability to create corporate memory and pass that on is going to be the future of competitive advantage.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a lot of good things have been said here. The one thing I'll add, you think about different types of ramp within an organization. You ramp up on the company, you ramp up on what your role is, what are your goals, what are your objectives, and then you have to ramp up on the systems. And we've all been there, right? Like, what is this product that we use? Why do we do it? If we can eliminate that, I think that's where the most potential is with AI, is like eliminate that ramp up so people can just, doesn't matter if I'm moving to a new role, I'm cross-skilling, like I know that the system won't fail me. I think that's really powerful for internal mobility.
My final question for the group is, you all have different hats in this space. Talk to your customer. So Ken, Melanie, Christina, talk to the learning leaders, and Brandon, talk to the entrepreneurs. What would be one hope you have for them going forward? What can you do differently? Just any kind of encouragement, advice, critique of that group. I'd love to hear. Go ahead, Melanie.
First, I think a lot about change management when it comes to learning the flow of work and how much it can help companies adapt to change a lot faster by removing some of the barriers of driving process change and driving system changes and introducing, new systems that are designed to make their employees more efficient. But so few companies do we see actually take the time to document these things and to train on these things. And so 98% of their budget and time goes to implementing the change, building the change, planning for the change, and about 2% goes towards the enablement of that change. And so my hope and wish for all of you is that, you really take a step back and look at, how are you allocating your training, documentation, your change management resources, and how much of it is going towards actually enabling on that change, driving adoption of that change, and how can you really start building a habit within your culture around documentation. AI should make that a lot easier when it comes to your point, removing that blank canvas, right? Getting you maybe 60, 70, 80% of the way. But ultimately, it's going to require developing that internal muscle of making documentation, making training, making communicating change a habit. And I think that there is a long way to go for organizations to do that. So my hope is that you make that more of an intention within your organizations, because I do think that it will set you apart.
I agree. I want that to happen too. We surveyed our customers, and 70% said that less than half of their processes are documented. Which means there's a huge gap in knowing what to do when you need to know how to do it. And so, the thing that I'll say, not to be too redundant with what Melanie said, is that documentation is the leading indicator of operational excellence. We all say we want to be operationally excellent. Making sure your people know what they need to do with the tools that they use and when they need to know how to do it. I mean, that's your first step in getting there.
Kevin, you asked me to talk to the entrepreneurs in the room. And my first proposition is that that's all of us. And if we didn't walk into this room or walk into this conference feeling entrepreneurial, I think with all the things we've been talking about, even just over the course of today, we're entrepreneurs all over again, right? So this is real. I think this whole conversation really is for all of us. Like there's something meaningful in this conversation for all of us, no matter what sector we are, how long we've been doing it, or the role we play in our organizations. So with that being said, generally speaking, I would share a couple things that I've been sharing with myself because this is super disruptive for me in the work that I do and the work that the customer-facing work that we do at Zapier as well. And the first is like keep the human at the center of the story. Like we wake up, trying to make the world a better place in some form or fashion, and for people specifically, and like keep the human in the center of the story. I find that is like incredibly powerful when things are changing really quickly, and specifically when there's some type of technology challenge or something where that's where the source of fear and concern comes from. Make sure you know your story. Keep the human at the center of your story. And then the second thing is like be in community. Right? Like this work, whatever it is that we do, it is hard enough as it is, especially when things are changing quickly. So again, we're all here this week, hopefully in community with friends old and new. And I think for all of us, like we should just be reminded this is fuel in the tank. It's certainly the ideas, but also just like the persevering spirit that comes out of kind of swapping notes and being in this game together.
Bring us home, Christina.
I would encourage everyone to have an expansive view of skills. So it's not hard skills versus soft skills. It's hard and soft skills woven together, the way that they actually appear in the workplace. So I would encourage us to think about what the goal is and then work backwards from the goal, which is to do our jobs, which often require like an incredible tapestry and like multifaceted set of abilities. And I would also echo the community point. I mean, ultimately, it's not just about serving our teams, but aligning ourselves to the broader organization and the whole ecosystem that it serves.
Thank you, everyone. Wonderful to be here with you all, and hope you have a great rest of the conference.